Before you hit that skip button, you need to know one thing. Most people think revenge is about getting even. That's amateur hour. When you're dealing with seven figures and a high-powered attorney, revenge is about leveraging paperwork. It's about finding the one tiny, obscure rule they were arrogant enough to ignore. My name is Eleanor. I'm not doing time for armed robbery or some dumb street beef. I'm here because of a 3-page legal document that everyone, including me, thought was ironclad. My current address is cell block D9, and the view is strictly concrete. The reason I'm here? My Aunt Martha. Martha Sterling, a name that used to mean old money elegance in this state. Now it just means the next target on my blueprint. You see that phrase on the thumbnail, "I used her own law license to enter"? That's not hyperbole. That's the truth. She was a respected partner at Sterling and Associates, known for handling trusts and estates for the old guard. A real shark in silk. I was supposed to be her protege, the heir apparent, not just to her firm, but to the entire family fortune. A fortune that was, frankly, next level. My grandfather, bless his meticulous soul, set up the Sterling Family Trust back in '88. The rules were simple, clean, and classic old money. The principal was untouchable until I hit 30, but I got the income from it immediately upon turning 25. I was 24 and a half when the music stopped. The principal? Let's just say it was well into the tens of millions. The income alone was enough to make a decent living without ever clocking in again. Martha was the trustee, and, more importantly, the power of attorney for my grandfather in his final years. We're talking durable, comprehensive POA, the keys to the kingdom. My grandpa trusted her because she was family, she was a lawyer, and she had that perfectly coiffed, entirely fake air of high ethical standards. I trusted her because, well, I was young, and she was Aunt Martha. Big mistake. Huge. The POA was the gold mine she wanted, and she played the long game to get it. When Gramps started his cognitive decline, nothing dramatic, just slow fading, Martha was right there, the dutiful niece managing his affairs, signing his checks, and making sure I was always just busy enough with my own fledgling career to not look too closely at the quarterly statements. She was low-key brilliant. She never stole a dime until Gramps was gone. The fraud was set up years in advance, just waiting for the trigger. The trigger was the death of my grandfather. The day the will was read, she had control. But the problem for Martha was the trust. That thing was drafted with 1,000 legal firewalls. She couldn't touch the principal without a court order, and she couldn't get that without a massive, complicated legal fight. That would have drawn attention. Martha hates attention, unless it's flattering. Her strategy was much cleaner. She framed me. The frame job itself was masterful, a real deep fake of financial deception. Martha slowly funneled money from the trust's income accounts, the accounts that were supposed to start paying me in 6 months, into a series of shell corporations she controlled. She made sure all the final paperwork, the signed transfer authorizations, and the digital signatures pointed straight to my personal laptop and my offshore banking contacts I hadn't used in years. It was a digital ghost of my past. The transfer authorizations were the most chilling part. She forged my signature on documents, giving her the authority to act on my behalf retroactively. The POA was the mask she wore. The forged documents were the knife. She made it look like I was panicking before my grandfather's death, trying to loot the estate while he was still alive, and then blame her. The narrative she constructed was that of a greedy, entitled millennial trying to jump the line. It was compelling, especially to a judge who only sees the evidence on paper. When the state auditors finally showed up, they weren't looking at Martha, they were looking at me. They saw $1.2 million missing, transferred, and then buried in tax shelters. They saw my signatures, my digital fingerprints, and they saw a very convenient trail leading right to my desk. Martha had documentation for everything. She had emails from me that she wrote, authorizations from me that she forged, and even recorded voice memos that she spliced. She was covered 6 ways to Sunday. I remember the day of the arrest. It was a Tuesday. I was grabbing coffee before a board meeting, feeling pretty good about myself. Then 2 sharp-dressed guys flashed badges and told me I was under arrest for felony wire fraud and grand larceny. My life went from high-key professional to 0 to 60 chaos in about 30 seconds. I kept thinking, this is a joke. Martha will fix this. Martha didn't fix it. She visited me in the county lockup once. She brought a cheap box of cookies and an expression of deep professional regret. She told me the evidence was overwhelming and that as a matter of professional ethics, she couldn't represent me. But she had hired me the best criminal defense lawyer in the state, a guy who specialized in plea bargains. She said, "Eleanor, sometimes you just have to take the L and minimize the damage." That was the moment I stopped being confused and started being cold. That forced kindness, the professional regret, it was all performance art. She wasn't offering me defense. She was offering me a concession speech. She wanted me to plead guilty, take the short sentence, and vanish so she could continue to control the estate. That was her endgame. I fired the lawyer she hired. I represented myself for the bail hearing. I lost, obviously, but I used that time to get access to the discovery file. And that file was the roadmap. I wasn't looking at the evidence against me. I was looking at the missing pieces that protected her. The trial was a blur. Martha sat in the front row looking tearful and deeply concerned for my future. The judge bought her story hook, line, and sinker. I was convicted on all major counts. Sentencing was brutal. 4 years in a federal penitentiary for financial fraud. It was a complete takedown, total destruction. As the judge slammed the gavel, I looked right at Martha. She gave me the tiniest, almost invisible smirk, a flash of raw victory. And right then, sitting there in that courtroom, knowing I was going to prison for a crime she orchestrated, I made a promise to myself. It wasn't about the money anymore. The money was just scorekeeping. It was about taking the one thing she prized above all else, her perfect professional reputation. It was about that lawyer's license hanging on her wall. I realized I didn't need a phone call to expose her. I needed the State Bar Association. The day they shipped me from the county lockup to the federal facility, I mentally wiped the slate clean. No more anger, no more wishing I could rewind time. That kind of emotional baggage is heavy, and you don't get to carry heavy things in here. I had a new job now. Research. My body was incarcerated, but my brain was still on the clock. My Aunt Martha was about to find out that a 4-year sentence grants you a serious amount of free time to read the fine print. My first mission was the law library. It was sad, low-tech, and smelled like old coffee and defeat. But it had one thing the outside didn't: quiet and endless stacks of obscure legal journals. I wasn't researching my appeal. I was researching Martha's Achilles heel. She was a master of the major statutes, the big trusts, the federal transfers, but nobody is perfect. The deeper I dug into the Sterling family trust and the durable power of attorney document she used to frame me, the clearer her pattern became. Martha was a big picture shark. She hated the tedious, low-stakes administrative work. That POA document was the key. She used it to manipulate Graham's health status, move assets around, and ultimately transfer millions without his consent. But even the ironclad POA has rules, right? That's where the State Bar Association comes in. Attorneys have a higher fiduciary duty when acting as a POA for an incapacitated person, a term that applied to Gramps in his final months. This isn't just about civil court. This is about professional ethics and licensing. I spent weeks immersed in the state rules of professional conduct, the obscure, yellowing books nobody checks out. I was looking for the tiny, archaic rule that applied specifically to estate lawyers handling large family trusts where the grantor, Gramps, was deemed incapacitated. The statutes were dense, packed with jargon like res geste and caveat emptor, but I was determined to find the flaw in Martha's armor. It was a serious grind, but I had nothing but time. And then I found it, tucked away in a supplement to the 1993 State Bar Ethics Handbook. A section so old it was practically invisible was the specific requirement. Rule 7.4b, quarterly accountability filings. This rule dictated that any licensed attorney acting as a durable power of attorney for an incapacitated person whose estate exceeded a certain threshold, which Gramps' estate obviously did, was required to submit a quarterly financial accountability filing to the State Bar's Disciplinary Council. The filing wasn't complicated. It was just a summary sheet confirming no principal assets had been liquidated and that all quarterly income was properly accounted for. It was pure bureaucracy, the kind of filing Martha would beam beneath her time. It was designed to protect the very kind of person my grandfather was, wealthy, vulnerable, and trusting. And Martha, in her arrogance, had blown it off. Why file paperwork that proves you haven't stolen anything when the person you stole from is gone and the heir, me, is in prison? She figured the rule was archaic and irrelevant. She figured wrong. The beauty of the rule was twofold. First, it was mandatory, no wiggle room. Second, failure to file 3 consecutive times could, at the disciplinary council's discretion, automatically trigger a full-scale, non-discretionary financial conduct review of the attorney's entire professional history, including the files related to the POA. Martha hadn't filed at least the last 3 quarters before Gramps died, and she certainly hadn't filed since I was locked up. That was 5 missed filings. She was toast. I knew the technicality was on lock. The hard part was the execution. I couldn't just write a letter from federal prison. It would be flagged, ignored, or worse, intercepted by Martha's contacts. I needed a clean vector. I needed someone on the outside who was completely off Martha's radar and absolutely trustworthy. I ran a mental inventory of my contacts. Family was out. They were either manipulated by Martha or too afraid of her legal power. Friends were too emotional. I needed a professional. I needed a ghost. Then I remembered Frank Ortiz. He wasn't a lawyer. He was a former paralegal who worked at Sterling and Associates about a decade ago. He was a good guy, quiet, hyper-organized, and he hated Martha. Why? Because Martha had taken credit for a massive brief he had written during a complex merger case, effectively stifling his career growth and forcing him out. Frank was low-key, professional, and Martha wouldn't remember his face if he stood in front of her. He was now running a small, successful document management service miles away from the city. Perfect. He owed Martha nothing and likely owed me a quiet act of justice for the way she treated my grandfather. The problem was no direct contact. Every letter I sent from here was scrutinized. My conversations were monitored. I had to use a coded message that looked innocuous but would immediately trigger Frank's professional curiosity. I drafted the first communication through my assigned, barely used legal aid. I sent a request for an archived document retrieval to his company, referencing an old file number from a trust Gramps was involved in years ago. I knew that file number was fake, but the request included one specific phrase in the subject line that only Frank would recognize as a signal from the old firm, a specific, obscure internal code they used for sensitive, off-the-books research. Quote, "Please confirm availability of Project Chimera documents." Project Chimera was the name of the brief Martha stole from him. It was the call to arms. I sealed the envelope and watched the correctional officer drop it into the outgoing mail bin. The ball was now in motion. If Frank recognized the code and responded, the game was on. If he didn't, I would have to find another way. But my gut told me Frank was still carrying that grudge, and Martha's fall was the only way he'd ever truly get paid back for the brief she stole from him. The first move was complete. The waiting game was the hardest part of the grind. The waiting game after sending that coded request to Frank felt like a year compressed into a week, but patience is a professional skill. I knew Martha wouldn't move because she was confident I was neutralized. She was busy spending my inheritance. I, on the other hand, was waiting for the ping that told me the plan was live. 3 days later, I got a standard-looking legal envelope addressed from Frank Ortiz's document management company. It wasn't direct communication, it was better. Inside was a standard business card and a printed receipt for the archived document retrieval I had requested. Underneath the total, Frank had manually scribbled one word in tiny, neat print: Chimera, active. That was it. The code was recognized, the alliance was established, and Frank was ready to roll. Our communication had to be strictly one way and absolutely sterile. I used my allocated legal correspondence time to draft detailed, complex requests for documents. I couldn't write, "Please submit Rule 7.4B forms to the State Bar immediately." Instead, I wrote things like, "Regarding the Smith Trust, File 1993-4B, please search for precedents involving the non-filing of quarterly financial summaries by an attorney holding durable power of attorney in this specific district, paying close attention to the rules in effect prior to the 2005 amendment." Frank was smart enough to understand the code. A search for a precedent that didn't exist was code for, "I need you to find the exact rule that applies." The specific mention of non-filing of quarterly summaries was the deep dive instruction. Frank's first task was to confirm the failure. He used his paralegal access to public records Martha assumed nobody outside the firm would bother with. He had to look up the public filing dates for the Sterling Family Trust's associated accounts and cross-reference them with the official state bar records regarding POA accountability submissions. This was the smoking gun search. Martha was good, but she wasn't a ghost. Frank's next letter was sent a week later, posing as a request for clarification on fee schedules. Tucked at the bottom, he wrote, "The fees for Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4 of last year appear to be missing from the ledger. Unbelievable oversight." That was the payoff. She hadn't just skipped 1 or 2 filings. She had skipped 4 in a row, spanning a whole year, the most critical period surrounding Gramps' death and the transfer of my inheritance. She was so confident in the prison sentence and the strength of her legal reputation that she had become careless. Her arrogance was about to cost her everything. Now came the real legal heavy lifting. We needed to submit the missing quarterly accountability forms, Rule 7.4B. I spent 2 full weeks in the library, drafting every word. I didn't need to file my version of the truth. I needed to file the technical summary sheet required by the bar. I drafted the forms using the publicly available information, making no accusations, only pointing out the technical failure to file. I drafted 5 separate forms, one for each missed quarter, detailing the assets and movements as Martha should have filed them. The details had to be clinical and precise. I sent the 5 drafted summary sheets to Frank in increments, disguised as legal review documents for a fictional ongoing case. In the final letter, the code was the most intense yet. I wrote, "Please ensure the delivery is secured by certified mail, addressed specifically to the Disciplinary Council, and include a cover letter that references only the mandatory nature of Rule 7.4B. That was Frank's final instruction for execution. The beautiful thing about initiating a state bar investigation is that once the wheels start turning, they don't stop for power or reputation. Martha Sterling could charm a judge and manipulate a jury, but she couldn't charm a disciplinary council rulebook. She was caught in a bureaucratic checkmate initiated by 5 unassuming summary forms. The first sign that the plan was working was subtle.
My prison access to the legal news archives suddenly had a firewall around all content related to my old firm, Sterling and Associates. That meant Martha's team was trying to lock down the digital footprint. Too late, the damage was done. 2 weeks after Frank submitted the filings, Martha received the official notification. The District League Attorney had moved past the procedural review and opened a full financial conduct audit of her professional records related to the Sterling Trust. That was the moment her panic truly set in. She couldn't kill the investigation, she could only delay it. Every document she had used to frame me, the illegal transfers, the forged authorizations, was now subject to forensic accounting under the high scrutiny of the bar. The irony was the ultimate glow-up. The evidence that convicted me was the exact evidence that was about to disbar her. She had been so focused on getting me behind bars that she hadn't bothered to fully cover the tracks of the POA abuse itself. She used the estate's money to transfer funds illegally. Now the bar was asking, where did those funds go, Martha? The internal firm chaos must have been spectacular. Lawyers started jumping ship, refusing to cooperate with the audit, and Martha found herself isolated. Within 2 months, the findings of the bar's internal audit were undeniable. Martha had grossly violated her fiduciary duty as an attorney, engaged in self-dealing, and intentionally concealed financial information from the proper authorities, the bar in this case. The evidence was so clean, the disciplinary council had no choice. They immediately referred the case to the district attorney's office. Case closed. The external noise was thrilling even from the inside. News reports started circulating about a, quote, high-profile investigation into a prominent estate attorney for misappropriation of client funds. The focus wasn't on my conviction. The focus was on Martha's fall. The inheritance she stole, it was frozen by the state as evidence pending recovery. The ultimate payoff came 3 months after the submission. I was called to a non-monitored meeting with the warden and a clean-cut prosecutor I had never seen before. No more plea deals. This was a formal admission of error. The prosecutor told me my former attorney was disbarred, stripped of her license, and facing criminal charges for obstruction of justice and misappropriation. Then came the part that mattered. Based on the overwhelming new evidence discovered during the disciplinary council investigation, the court has ruled the evidence used to convict you was fabricated and illegally obtained. Your conviction has been overturned, effective immediately. You are a free woman, Eleanor. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just nodded. Vindication is cold. I had used 4 years of my life to buy 10 years of her absolute destruction. They processed my release quickly. I stepped out of the prison gates on a cold Friday afternoon. There was no fanfare, no family waiting, just the silence of my victory. The final tally was beautiful in its precision. Eleanor served 3 years for a crime she didn't commit, recovered the full family inheritance, minus legal fees, gained absolute control. Martha Sterling lost her law license, the source of her identity and power, lost her reputation, faced disbarment and a pending 5-year sentence for the criminal charges stemming from the POA abuse. Martha took my freedom. I took her professional life. And in her world, a professional life, the carefully crafted image, the high-profile clients, the law license, is worth more than any family trust. She had tried to beat the system, but I used the fine print of the system itself as my weapon. I drove past the Sterling and Associates office building on my way out of the city. The name was already half removed from the glass. My name is Eleanor. I didn't seek justice. I sought finality. And in the high-stakes world of financial betrayal, finality is absolute. The blueprint worked.